Hello, everybody. My name is John Barnwell, and I am with you here in the Motor City, Detroit, the Straits, here in the U.S. of A, state of Michigan, across the border from Canada. Canada. That's a Detroiter joke. Anyways, I'm here on this 9/11 show with Pastor David William Parry, the formidable scholar and aficionado of all things pointing towards truth. And so that's how I derived the title of our show, What is Truth?, of which this is episode 96. And last week we had a good time. A good time was had by all, as they say. And mention came up of Lord Bulwer Lytton, and Pastor David chimed in that it'd be a good idea to do something about him. So I thought, well, that sounds like a thing that will fit into days, the meaning of the day, shall we say? Even Van Morrison wrote a song about one of the subjects that Bulwer Lytton covered in his novel Zanoni, and that's the dweller on the threshold, sometimes known as the guardian on the threshold. And it's that part of your dynamic self that keeps you out of the spiritual world. And so perhaps we can take a bird's eye view of some of that subject matter, since it's so relative and relevant to the work of Lord Bulwer Lytton. Reverend David here, Pastor David, as they say, in the city of London and merry old England. How you doing there, Pastor David?
Well, I can't move for royal things at the minute. How am I doing? Okay, I think I'm managing to survive it all as a bitter Republican. Wait, oh God, where do I start with all that? Great to speak to you as always, John. I've literally just finished my monthly online Persian Christian fellowship gig, so I'm still sort of half thinking about that. I'm really pleased we're talking about Sir Edward, an incredible guy, an incredible author. Wondering what's been going on in Britain for the last week. I mean, certainly the passing of the old Queen, who in some ways did a remarkable job. I mean, why aren't these things ever clean and straightforward? Because it was basically her influence that started the whole diversity thing here and the inclusion thing here. It certainly wasn't any of the parliaments. The fact, of course, she was an initiated druid, which I think might scare people in America more than it does here, because there are two groups. That's me being two. I don't know if there are any links. In Wales, you uncultured American swines. It's cultural, and it's all about picking a poet, normally from obscurity on accounts of the state, much to their horror, and getting people dressed up in long white gowns to applaud them, and then dressing them up in a long white gown. So the Queen was actually. Has it got anything to do with the original Druids? Does anything have anything to do with the original Druids? Probably not. I mean, it's a nice. I mean, even Rowan Williams, the previous Archbishop of Canterbury, was a member of it because it's just a cultural thing. Like a sort of I don't know, a defense of of Welsh culture. I think they that's why they put their feet down so strongly about that. don't particularly like the poets they choose. Although I would love to win an Eisteddfod. If anybody's listening, I would love to win an Eisteddfod. And the Queen was part of that, not the neo-pagan group which I can only interpret as sort of a response of the Romantics to indigenous spiritual forms before Christianity. I mean, what else could it be? I mean, they're not offering human sacrifices. They're looking decorous at various meetings. So let's get a grip before we start panicking. So they turn up. Yes, John.
You don't have a wicker man set up in your backyard, do you?
Well, no, and neither do they. I mean, that's why the whole thing is a bit hysterical. I mean, I've met a couple of them through the years. I mean, oh God, there's only so much you can say about Victorian England. Give it a rest. And do the standing stones and the ancient marbles need to be protected? I can't think of anyone that doesn't think that. Oswald Spengler, Jimmy Savile, who's been photographed with Prince Charles, was also a druid. That means absolutely nothing. I've also stood by some prominent druids, and it doesn't mean I'm like Jimmy Savile. The end. No, this whole guilt by association, modern conspiracy bollocks, I've absolutely no time for it all. We all need to get a grip and stop being worried by being in the camera frame at a particular time. That really irritates me, that sort of thing. Was the Queen involved in diabolical rituals? Well, maybe, but it was nothing to do with Welsh druidry, because they wouldn't have the imagination. I mean, the recent archdruid, can't remember his name. It's always something arcane and deeply Welsh. Geraint something or other, can't remember it. I mean, what was his claim to fame? Having a row with a policeman because he parked in the wrong place after one of the recent assemblies, and telling him, the policeman, "Do you know who I am?" Which is a death sentence in this country. So then the copper feels, right, all right, who are you then? And the whole thing escalates from there. No, so she actually removed herself a couple of years ago from the Order of Druids because some snotty young professor reminded her that you could only be a member of that group of druids if you spoke Welsh. The Queen did not speak Welsh, so she had to. Isn't that bad for them as opposed to the other way around? She had to remove herself from the lines of druidry. As I say, the neo-pagans, I've met a couple of them. They're very good on the trombone in Stonehenge. I've welcomed the sun with some of them. Is that what the ancient druids would have done? Really problematic, and the answer is basically no. Decent, lovely people, but at my age, I prefer cocktails in somebody's front room as opposed to, bearing my arse to the elements before sunrise on Midsummer's Day. I'm sorry. There's all that going on. But to her credit, I don't go for all this lizard stuff, by the way. I think people have been grossly rude, and I'm totally against it. So don't speak ill of the dead. If you do, don't speak to me. I think there's something gross and disgusting and really deeply impolite in that. What is she now? A dead woman with a family who are grieving. And if you can't respect that, please don't talk to me, because I don't want to talk to you. Was she guiltless and innocent, as the media are now trying to pretend? Of course not. It doesn't mean all the rest of it has gone away, but it does mean I think we have to draw a line. And some of the things that have been pouring across the internet recently, which are born of nothing apart from fantasy and financial bitterness, really need to get a grip, because it just shows how low our society has sunk. And that's my view of all of it. Let's look at the positives. You look at the positive elements of somebody's past life. She was a champion of diversity, inclusion, and tolerance. That needs to be done, because none of the parliaments did that. None of them. They're too busy trying to carve each other up. Prince Charles, as someone that's travelled way outside the Western sphere, let me assure everybody here that the one thing everybody fears is an unclear succession of power, because a whole society and culture can collapse at a time like that, where the warlords come out and everything is divided between their gun-toting soldiers. So let me assure you, that is not a trivial matter. I thought the succession, and they televised it, which was very interesting. So it's the same power elite looking after each other again and again and again. That's where we look for the conspiracies, not these bloody lizards. You know, I'll just finish off, John. I promise I'll finish. And so what did Charles say? Basically, more of the same, which is good. Constitutional monarchy. What they're meant to be, they're not. But what they're meant to be is the living embodiment of the Constitution. Since we don't have a written Constitution, we need a written Constitution, but we don't have one. What they're meant to be is the guardian of Hansard, the guardian of that type of Constitution that's actually embedded in civic ceremony. Weird British stuff, yeah. And to hear more of the same was actually quite reassuring, because I think he now looks like the last monarch. So I was disappointed Republican David couldn't start shouting and screaming, because I simply didn't want to be associated with the voices who were disgusting. But I will say my level Pennethworth when Charles goes. He's in his 70s, because we need a change of direction and to come of age. John. Mr. Boston, so more it be Perry. I'm Parry, not Perry. But as I say, try not go to those parts of the world where such things are not certain, and see how you fare there, and if the secret police beat you up or not for simply being a foreigner in the wrong place at the wrong time. This part of the world is too smug, it's too arrogant, and it forgets the things that hold it together. And that's why I'm not running through the streets with a Kalashnikov, because it could get worse. Let's try and make it better without it getting worse. John?
Yes. Yes, it's not nice to speak ill of the dead. And while I could do that for the full hour and a half here today, I will refrain from that, because now we can clearly see the living, and it's been that way for some time, although people are not fully aware of it, but he's been deeply embedded into the affairs of the Privy Council for his life. And it's really the Privy Council that's holding the ship together, as they say over in the UK. And these are people that people in America never heard of. And likewise here, if you really look under the hood here in America at what's been going on, the fingerprints of Hillary are all over what's going on behind the scenes. And anybody who's done any homework on the subject knows that that's been that way for a long time, that she was behind the scenes with Bill, and behind the scenes with, kind of more prominent under Barry, and but she just never goes away.
How come that guy has an Irish name, Barack Obama? What part of Ireland is he from then?
Yeah, well, now we have O'Biden, and but it's really Joe Clinton. It's a more accurate realpolitik, as they say. So I don't want to talk about all that stuff anyways. I'd much rather talk about Bulwer-Lytton, who's a fascinating character by any measure. You have to realize that Bulwer-Lytton, first off, it's Edward George Earl Lytton, Bulwer-Lytton. He's the first Baron Lytton. He was born in 1803 on May 25th, and he passed away in January 18th, 1873, in the city of Torquay, by the way, which is an interesting city. If you just do a search on the Rudolf Steiner archive, you'll see that some of the most fascinating lectures that Rudolf Steiner ever gave were in the city of Torquay when he would come to England. And so it's quite fascinating. But yeah, he's a conservative. He was a Whig and then a conservative, and he became Secretary of State for the colonies. And by the way, most people don't know, but he declined the royal crown of Greece in 1862 after King Otto abdicated. But he ultimately ended up becoming Baron Lytton of Nebworth, and Nebworth House, or really, you should call it a castle. I mean, it's a massive structure, was his own. But he was the biggest author in England during his lifetime. But he worked so bad, so hard, that he was totally stressed out because, see, he married this Irish lassie that the family didn't approve of, and they essentially disowned him. And so he made his way in the world, starting off writing poetry, as Brits are wont to do, but getting into writing the novel. And he can be credited with really the primogenitorship of several different genres of literature in the type of historical things that he wrote, like, for example, The Last Days of Pompeii, which has been made into a movie on more than one occasion, and which most people have seen and didn't know it was Bulwer Lytton. But in the circle of the esoteric, he's most well known for his novel Zanoni. And there's also, of course, Alice and The Strange Story, which are also very interesting, esoteric, slanted novels. But in Zanoni, you get an inkling of the stature of Bulwer Lytton when he goes into his explanation, the experience with the dweller on the threshold. And you don't know about that unless you know something. Because back when he wrote that book, it wasn't anything you could just go look up in a library. You know, the way it is now, you just Google it. Well, it wasn't that way back then. So he was obviously very versed in the esoteric. He was very good friends with Eliphas Levi, for example, and they attempted to invoke the spirit of Apollonius of Tyana at one time. So he was a real character. But toward the end of his life, he would recite poetry, and he had a young woman that would travel with him to events, and she'd play this harp, and he would say some lines, and she'd play a little bit of harp music, and then he'd say some more lines. So it's very much in keeping with that whole bardic druid type stream. But the Northern European, as I've tried to make clear on many occasions, stringed music is the North. The pipes, the flutes, that's the Southern mystery, right? And you trombone players too. That's Southern mysteries. And so there's a different thing going on when you create music with a string instrument. And by the way, piano doesn't count. Piano is actually a quite out of tune percussion instrument. But so I just want to let David fly on Bulwer Lytton for a while, see what he comes up with.
Oh, I love Rachmaninoff. How can you not love Rachmaninoff? That's the vindication of piano. No, I mean, just to round off that, I know a lot can be said.
I love the piano,
I mean,
but it's the devil's playground. It's all out of tune, actually.
It's a great playground. Yeah, I think we gotta make room for things like pianos. I'm not Amish. Yeah, just round the Queen thing off. Yes, it did irritate me because it's one of my personal things. And if we want to talk about tradition, guys, that is tradition. Don't speak it of the dead. Okay, you can't be traditionalists and then start doing stuff like that because they don't do stuff like that. What you're meant to do, according to Western tradition, European tradition, North European tradition, is actually only remember the positives because they're gone. And that safeguards certain things, I think, including our own sanity. What are we doing with the situation as it is now? That's infinitely more important. And that's the line drawn under that. Oh gosh, Sir Edward Bulwer Lytton. I mean, was he a Freemason or not? I like his short stories. Oh God, right. I'm such a bitch. I can't stand the poetry. I can't stand the poetry. Like Crowley, love. I can't stand your poetry. Stop it, please. The only one I liked was that thing Crowley wrote about. What was it? I.O. Pan. What was it that he wanted read aloud at his cremation? And the local mayor.
He wrote a couple good things.
Oh no, Johnny!
Long Odds is
Well, all right, maybe one or two, but overall, I can't stand.
And the thing about Rudolf Steiner is actually quite funny.
Right,
On melanin, on suckling pigs,
I'm not getting
peace
drawn on
the great white brotherhood.
I'm not getting drawn on that. Now, my favourite story, curiously, is that when Crowley showed his notebook, his poetry to W.B. Yeats, and W.B. Yeats went completely quiet. And Crowley, not ever being one to be beaten by a situation, said it was clear that his jealousy had stunned him into silence. So, because he cannot imagine being beaten at anything. So, I like that I.O. Pan thing. I think it was I can't remember. What was it? Brighton? It wasn't Brighton. Where the mayor of the local town got up halfway through saying, "This is disgraceful," and walking out with the other dignitaries during the cremation. So I quite like that. I can't stand his poetry, although one or two ideas, one or two images in Bulwer Lytton actually flower. John.
Well, there's a funny aside regarding William Butler Yeats. James Joyce was a young pup coming up, and of course, genius by any measure. And he told the story about how he went up to the apartment of William Butler Yeats, knocked on the door, and Yeats, by the time this occurred, was a wizened old man. And he opened the door, and Joyce took one look at him and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, you're too old. I can't help you." And then turned around and walked away.
Oh, life can be cutting. Life can be cutting. A genius by any stretch of the imagination. I think Irish literature is such a fascinating field. I gave a couple of lectures on it. A decade ago. Where does time go to, John? Because you get the traditionalists like Yeats, you get the no, don't answer.
Why am I not surprised?
Yeah, don't answer. I did have a thing about Celtic literature, which actually I might still have at the back of my mind somewhere. English literature doesn't need to make any apologies, but all right, where are the sources? And if you start looking at the sources, a lot of them are Celtic, and that just can't be brushed away too easily. And I noticed people in the Oxbridge Triangle. Do you know things go missing in triangles, don't they? Can't most of the people that go to those universities just go missing? They tend to. They say about Shakespeare that he had a Welsh schoolmaster because they can't imagine. They can't imagine, Shakespeare standing on its own, and they're trying to make leeways and bridges to other people, but it won't work. It won't work. Anyway, to the point. I like Bulwer Lytton's short stories, actually much more than the novels. I don't know if you've ever read The House and the Brain, which is one of my Mr. Boston. We are only missing Douglas Gabriel. It's John's program. I have no power over these things. So this show is turning into anarchy. I love it. Because that was written by an adept, and it was clearly written by an adept. And there were rumors in the family, as far as I remember, that actually a lot of unpublished material was burnt by his wife when the death, when the funeral of Bulwer Lytton had passed, when it had gone. And a lot of it apparently was the occult material, which hadn't reach the light of day. It might be one of those apocryphal stories. It might be one of those rumors. Who knows? But it's an interesting one. And certainly The House and the Brain struck me from the very opening sentence that an adept must have written it, because it begins as the honest and ordinary story of a haunted house where someone, John.
Yeah, at time you want to make clear who you're referring to, because we were just talking about William Butler Yeats, and then there's Lord Lytton, and then there's James Joyce. So we just have to make these notes so people don't get lost.
Sorry, all. It's John's fault. He triggers me. What can I say? We make a good combo. He triggers me. Yeah, I mean, I do love the poetry of W.B. Yeats, and he won the Nobel Prize. I don't like the poetry of Aleister Crowley, who did not win the Nobel Prize.
Yeats won the Nobel Prize after his work was edited by Ezra Pound, by the way.
Yeah.
Along with almost everybody in several decades, he'd edit their work and then they'd win the Nobel Prize.
We need to resuscitate Ezra Pound. I mean, I wrote an apologetic for Ezra Pound a couple of years ago, which was published in International Relations, if anybody's interested. And I'm a purely online magazine. And I explained what I thought had actually happened. I mean, it's very unclear that Ezra Pound was a fascist, whatever that means anyway. And you're looking at someone like a crushed idealist who was caught along by history. And we've really got to resuscitate his work. I mean, the American intelligence service did such a good job on him that after the war, he even disparaged his own poetry, which, as you say, had led a number of people not only to international recognition, but Nobel Prizes. And Ezra Pound's poetry is crisp, it's clever, it's intelligent, it's exceedingly deep. And it's very, very wrong of any organization, for no matter what ideological reason, to beat people into that type of submission. It's just very wrong. John?
You could consider Charles Olson his successor, really, with his Maximus poems.
I love the Black Mountain poets. I love Charles Olson. There was somebody wrote what I got out of Maximus, what I got out of the Maximus letters. I think that needs to be revived as well. I mean, chalk and cheese. Ezra Pound is forgotten because he's politically out of favour, but for the most dubious of reasons. And that really needs just to be challenged very, very, very strongly, as I hope I started to do. I hope other people join me in that. And certainly the Black Mountain poets in this part of the world are barely known, because the feeling, again, quite wrongly, is that they're writing about Americana and an American consciousness. That's only that you only arrive at that opinion if you haven't read them. They are, these people are speaking about global. I know certain people on this show hate that word. Let me say universal. They're writing about universal themes. What if there is such a thing as a common humanity? What would it be? How would it speak? That is deeply. John doing it again. Oh, I love you doing that. I mean, we've got to have more mayhem on this show. It brings things to life. So yeah, I mean, I think the Black Mountain poets really need more. We need to do some more work on them in this part of the world to see why the mantle passes to them, as it clearly does. Speaking about Lord Lytton, obviously, I want us to get to the coming race at some point, because a lot is missed in that story. The fact that the explorer is actually in a trance each time he sees the beings below the earth, that cannot be simply brushed away. That's very important. And, just to round off, as I was saying, my favorite short story is The House and the Brain, which Bulwer Lytton starts by, an ordinary haunted house story, and it really ricochets, it bounces all over the place to being an occult experiment that's been set up by somebody with huge psychic power to take revenge on the people that have lived within that particular house. And this guy actually turns up to see how his device, what has happened to his device, why has it been destroyed, and then opens up the people around him to make prophecies of the future. This can only have been written by an occult adept. It cannot have been written by anybody else. And it had me thinking for months after I read it, is that the power of a short story? Because that's remarkable. The themes and the way they're discussed, the themes and the way they're described, absolutely extraordinary, which puts the other books in an even greater context. Let's go for it. What do you think of The Coming Race, John?
Well, yeah, I think it's a fascinating portrayal of certain recurring themes. I mean, you know, you can go into it's sitting over here somewhere. Where is it? Oh no. Yeah, here it is. Here's something that ties into this whole drama. The Kingdom of Agartha, A Journey into the Hollow Earth by Marquis Alexander Saint-Ives d'Alvedre. And that whole idea that there's this subterranean magical kingdom is right in there with the concept of Shambhala and the sacred island of Shambhala, the land of the adepts. But if somebody is a genuine occultist, they of course know that it's not a physical location at this time, that it's has to do with a state of consciousness. It's above the terrestrial realm, so to speak, and its gates are well guarded by the guardian on the threshold. And it's a fascinating challenge, but there's also other works that deal with the subject matter with the traditionalist authors, René Guénon and so on and so forth. Blavatsky deals with it, of course. I discussed it with Thomas Benyakia, the spokesman for the Hopi Elders. I was discussing the mention of subterranean caves by Madame Blavatsky and Isis Unveiled, and he says, "Oh yes, we have caves that extend beneath the ocean all the way over to Asia." And I thought, well, first off, I never heard that before. And so I guess you heard it first here, because I haven't mentioned it too often, because people's eyes, they kind of glaze over. And what would that mean? Well, you know, could you even survive something like that? But there's vents all over the planet. The planet is quite a complex organism, so to speak. But in getting in, I want to get deeper into Beauxville before we use up all of our time. So please, let me just share a couple of things that'll trigger you, I'm sure, because Beauxville, people they say things, they use phrases of his. You know, they've heard all these phrases. He coined the great unwashed. That was him. The almighty dollar. The pen is mightier than the sword. And of course, dweller on the threshold. But the opening phrase, "it was a dark and stormy night," that led to the creation of the Bulwer Lytton fiction contests starting in 1982, and it's seeking the opening sentence of the worst of all possible novels. So they're being very, very disrespectful of the leading author of the Victorian era. In fact, he was the one who gave Charles Dickens the support to launch Charles Dickens' career. And so he's a formidable figure in England, although he's almost unknown here in the US.
Well, I'm tempted to say who's known here at all, let alone in the sort of pig ignorant modern Britain. Yeah, I mean, if you get to the circles of the literati and they shrink by the year, certainly that name will come up. But if there's any depth to the reference, that will be nearly miraculous. Um, I'm getting to that, Mr. Boston. You beat me to it. I'm getting to that. Why do I hate theories of the flat Earth? Because I prefer theories of the hollow Earth, and you can't have both. So, oh gosh, yeah. I mean, was it Hitler? Let's get to it. Right? Was it Hitler's favorite book? I don't know. Does anybody know that for certain? Was it Himmler's favorite book?
You mean The
Certainly,
Coming Race?
The Coming Race.
Well, there's people that have said that is a key for understanding some of that, but it is interesting to note that the German edition of The Coming Race was translated, as I said last week, by Gunther Wachsmuth, who was a key figure, member of the Vorstand. And actually, at one time I had a copy of the German translation of The Coming Race signed by Gunther Wachsmuth. But that went the wayside, as did many things, including my complete collection of the novels of Bulwer-Lytton.
You are fully aware that's completely upstaged me. I can't throw anything like that back because I wish I had that.
In French calf with marbled boards and end papers, top edge gilt.
Rub it in, John. Rub it into a poor clergyman. Go on. A high-ranking Freemason, although if rumor has it correctly, always at odds with them. I find that very, very interesting. They didn't like some of his theories. They didn't like some of his writings. Certainly, Bulwer-Lytton belongs to that period of Victorian literature where the Gothic and the Romantic, in an occult sense, were really shunned. And that's why probably he didn't get, I mean, he got, incredible recognition in his day, but it wasn't enduring recognition, and that's what he deserves. John.
Yeah, his parallel in France would have been George Sand, the sponsor of Friedrich Chopin and his girlfriend, so to speak. I guess would be the best way to characterize it. And she wrote occult novels of sorts too, that Rudolf Steiner spoke quite highly of. By the way, on The Hollow Earth, Rudolf Steiner concurs with the idea that the Earth is a geode of sorts, with a hollowing toward the center. But you have the interesting depiction of the 9 layers of the Earth. Maybe we can get into that sometime. It's pretty deep stuff, though. A friend of mine who passed away a little while ago, Paul O'Leary, he put together a collection of Rudolf Steiner's on the subterranean layers of the Earth, and so that's a very fascinating subject. But continue on.
I mean, this is one of those subjects that can just get deeper and deeper and deeper. Certainly, I'm not, excuse me, John, I'm not associating his work with what you must. I hate modern critics. They can't work out the difference between the supernatural and science fiction. And, the circles of the so-called literati in London at the minute are tantamount to dreary and pathetic, because you can't get past the Asian novelist who's got to teach us all basic lessons in morality because we never knew them before. And that's not said against people like Salman Rushdie, who is an incredible writer. But this woke nonsense really needs to stop trying to engineer everything, because it's just going to explode in its own face, and it's already causing irreparable damage. So talking about old white men like Bulwer-Lytton is a no-no. No, sod off. I like talking about old white men, and I like talking about Bulwer-Lytton. There we are. It shows no depth, but they don't want to face that one. And it also shows no learning, and they don't want to face that one either. Because it comes out in the criticism. The supernaturalist genre was actually quite potent in Victorian times. I mean, we talked about it recently. We talked about Vathek. I mean, Tudor Pole has come up before, which was not considered the same as occult writing, at least by the critics of that particular period, and that is very important. I think there's such a thing as splitting hairs, all that said. What Bulwer Lytton does is stretch beyond. He comes up with an idea, and what he does is expand the idea step by step by step, logically, until you end up with a scenario, and the scenario begs other scenarios to occur. And that is certainly what is happening. And I think he might be one of the pioneers of that, actually. In the novel form, it was always in theatre after Shakespeare. But it hadn't really gone into the novel, and it's done in the novel in a unique way, because in theatre you've got to make sure certain issues are sort of hammered down, they're pinned down before, it's got to go along with the libretto, and it's got to go along with the music if there is any, and yada yada. But certainly in terms of the novel, I mean, it evolved the novel hugely, and the novel started doing things which simply theatre didn't. I'm not going to say couldn't, because nobody ever gives the funding to try. But let's say it didn't do. And the novel becomes something actually quite different after Bulwer Lytton. It becomes like a maze of different interconnecting concepts and notions. It becomes like an Aladdin's cave that leads to a mystery. And what he would do is set the core idea and allow it to unfold until you ended up with something verging on the supernatural. And curiously, he pulled back at that point. He doesn't seem to want to go too far into areas that he seems to have thought the uninitiated, and we can all argue till we're blue in the face about what that means. He doesn't really want to cross a certain type of boundary. Now, is that because he doesn't think it's the business of literature? I'll just finish this, John. Or is it because he thinks he's doing that for our own protection? John?
Yeah, well, that kind of brings up something that's very relevant here. And it centers around, of course, a great many British authors made note of Zanoni, and it's been in print ever since it first came out. In fact, it was even printed for a time. I don't know if it is right now, but it was printed for a time by one of the anthroposophical publishing companies back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, whatnot. And so it really has a formative role in Western occultism. And if you take it and you look into the significance of it, you can go to C.G. Harrison, Charles George Harrison, in his book, The Transcendental Universe, that I've mentioned many times, 6 lectures on occult science, theosophy, and the Catholic faith. Now, Charles George Harrison was a high church Anglican, independent Rosicrucian, and so he would speak more freely about certain subjects because he was not under oath not to, because he did it on his own, through his own studies, what he attained as far as his own personal development and clairvoyance. But he says regarding the content of Zanoni, the core content that's made reference to, like I said, even by Van Morrison in his song, The Dweller on the Threshold. But he says, and I quote, and this is in Transcendental Universe, 1896, pages 42 to 46. I don't know that I'll get through the whole thing. But now, as these lectures are for the purpose of giving information and not tantalizing or mystifying, I will do my best to try and explain by analogy the nature of the strange experience to which I have referred. The most grotesque notions prevail concerning the dweller on the threshold, which probably have arisen from a too literal interpretation of the experiences of Glyndon in that magnificent allegory of Zanoni, or rather, let me say, since the author disclaims the term allegory on the ground that the characters are not personifications of abstract things such as virtues or qualities, that magnificent parable of human aspirations after the ideal. He admits, however, that, quote, beneath the narrative it relates, typical meanings are concealed, end quote. He certainly did not mean that a veiled figure whose eyes gleam with demoniac fire appears to the actual sight, whether normal or clairvoyant. In the case of Glyndon, it was the fiend of his own unholy desires which, in the light that flashed upon him at the instant of crossing the threshold, appalled him by revealing in all its naked native hideousness the close affinity which existed between the forces born of the corruption of his own lower nature and the destructive forces of the planet, constituting a fatal bond of attraction between himself and the evil ministers of disease and death. I think I'll stop there and maybe it'll come up later. And so there you have it, that there's this dynamic, that there's this beingness, we'll call it, because it's something that is fashioned out of your own nature. And there's two different guardians. There's the lesser guardian on the threshold and the greater guardian on the threshold that Rudolf Steiner clarifies in Knowledge of Higher Worlds and Its Attainment, originally published as The Way of Initiation. But in there, he explains the dynamic, and that there's the greater guardian and the lesser guardian, that one of them has to do with when you fall asleep at night, and the other one has to do with when you wake up in the morning. And so, Reverend David, I ask you, so which one's which? Which one's a morning and which one's the evening guardian, do you think?
Right,
It's okay. You could just say you don't know.
I don't know, and I'm fighting with tech at the minute to make things even worse. Yeah, I think you have to experience these things to give meaningful answers. I'll tell you what I want.
Let me finish the concept first.
Sorry.
Then you can expound. So when you go to sleep at night, you never quite know when you fall asleep, right? But you're aware almost instantaneously when you wake up in the morning. So your lesser guardian pertains to waking up in the morning, and the greater guardian is the one when you're going to sleep at night. And so it's important to understand that dynamic, because they lead into different levels of the, shall we say, subconscious being in which you participate. And that's going into that realm that I've typified before, that Rudolf Steiner describes as Kyrios. Kyrios is translated Lord in the Bible, but he says, well, it's really pertaining to the Christ in you. That's that individual divine, shall we call it divine seed. It's that philosopher's stone that dwells in your heart, that is the eternal aspect of your being. That's your chance for a bounteous future as you develop beyond the human stage. And of course, to forsake that is to forsake that path of humanness, and then you can participate in the realm of the subhuman, which, well, if that's your thing, go ahead, by all means. But if I had my druthers, I think I would take the previous path, in the path of completion, of becoming fully human. And so that's what we're looking at here. And when you have the dweller on the threshold, it's going to show you what you haven't got finished yet. It's going to frightfully you will experience this dynamic. Now, depending on the state of your own courage and equilibrium is what happens, because it's not going to hurt you. unless you like totally lose your cool, because it's something that's there, and I can attest from my own experience, it's very, very real.
Yeah, I mean, I think the initiatic journey is certainly not explored all the way through, but clearly signposted by Bulwer Lytton. And again, I did notice when I was reading those books many years ago how cautious he is about getting beyond a certain point. My own view, which is based on the literature, not the metaphysics, is that he felt it was just wrong to go theoretical other steps further, because they shouldn't just be theoretical, which would be the Freemason in him coming out, I suppose. Certainly, hang on, John, I'm going to mute while I cough. Certainly, when you were reading all that out a moment ago, the author that came to mind, curiously, was Arthur Machen, and the novel The Great God Pan, a very unsettling story, which might also have been one of Hitler's favourite books, apparently, although I think that's a lot less easy to justify. With the idea that basically there are sensitives, you either are or you aren't. There we are. People wandering around the world aimlessly. I love the cat. I love the cat with the ruffle. And I couldn't afford that costume. And, my God, what was that cloth of gold? I could definitely never afford that. The idea that people are wandering around aimlessly and there are dark spiritual powers looking for them and waiting to ambush them and spirit them away to what he would have called euphemistically the other side of the world, to work their machinations upon people. And it was really them giving in. It wasn't anything else. Put up a fight, for heaven's sake. Remember your humanity. Remember there's more to you than that. And the sad conclusion, or rather the sad inference of the story, was most people wouldn't, because it was just sort of a ride. It was just sort of oh my God, what an experience. And I think Machen is way ahead of his time in that sort of thing. And that is antithetical to Bulwer Lytton. Bulwer Lytton treads with the soft footsteps of a master during an exam. He's there, but he doesn't really, he won't give you any more. That's it. You've been given something in class. It is not going any further. Have you done the legwork? Have you put in the hours? Have you joined an initiatic society, by which I assume he must have meant the Masons? Which, of course, are much more of a problematic and multifaceted phenomena than modern conspiracy theorists want them to be. And of course, I mean, it's not. Now I'm defending the Masons. God, what a week! I'm defending the Royals and defending the Masons. So something is going deeply wrong. But anyway, certainly in that period, a lot of them are a force for the good. And Grand Lodge, to this day, says there are only 4 degrees. It's the side lodges that claim all these other degrees, according to Grand Lodge. So that raises other questions like, okay, Bulwer Lytton probably demonstrably was in Grand Lodge. What else was he doing? But certainly it's tempting to think he was doing other things, and we'll get to it. We're factoring in now, like the Hollow Earth, which can't simply be seen as psychology. Anyone that's interested in Jung or Freud, the minute the term Hollow Earth comes up, will instantly think that the subconscious mind, and that's a fair enough association. Hang on, I've had a frog in my throat all day, and that is a very decent association, but certainly that is not the limit to which Bulwer Lytton seems to want to take it, although, as I intimated a few moments ago, it's the story of an American explorer, that is not coincidental, who has an accident, some say a series of accidents, while potholing, and he discovers and encounters an inner earth, a race in the inner earth that looks strangely like Egyptians or Assyrians, and who have mastered this terrible power, this magical power called Vril. The people have named themselves after this force. They've called themselves the Vril Yar. And, he's made very aware that even a child has the power to kill people around him. Therefore, their whole society is built on highly hierarchical and structured and ceremonial principles. So everybody respects everybody else. It's not noticed on a cursory read that each time he encounters these beings, the protagonist is actually in a trance. So how far is this separated from the subconscious mind? I don't know. And is it really, even if it's not separated too far, that doesn't discount the fact we're talking about actual hollow earths. Like this earth plane, it's more than one thing at the same time. Like a hollow earth would be more than one thing at the same time. And certainly the last threats, or are they promises, of the Vril Yar, that they went beneath the earth, as far as I remember, because of some primordial cataclysm, and one day they'd emerge again and sweep everything away, and nothing would be able to stop them. And only those that ingratiated themselves to these new tyrants, the master race, which is how they see themselves, only those ingratiating themselves to this unstoppable population would actually survive the transitional process. Yes, it's led to lots of other connections. Certainly, there does seem to have been in Berlin a group called the Luminous Lodge. So, is that Freemasonic or not? If it is, it's certainly one of these side orders that were practicing developing Vril power. They were practicing the development of Vril power by weird exercises. I've only come across a couple of examples. They cut an apple in two and stare at one of the slices of the apple. Isn't that weird? And they were convinced they were getting results. And they wanted to meet and encounter these beings, but I mean, it leads to crazy stuff, which seems to have some veracity to it. Certainly, Himmler, the second genius of the Third Reich, seems to have felt there was some sort of validity to these tales, and ends up, if these sources can be trusted, funding expeditions, not only to make contact with these beings, but to share their technology and make a deal with them, make an agreement with them. Certainly, it can be demonstrated that happened in terms of Tibet. The Third Reich was funding trips to Tibet, and it was looking for the mystical sciences associated with that place. Some say with the connections in the hollow earth, into the hollow earth that they had. I heard years ago somebody was talking about the fact they were interested in what the Native Americans were also saying about it, so that would fit in with what you're saying, John. And of course, it links in certainly with Mongolia and my beloved Central Asia, because sometimes these cities are meant to be taken as physical places. Agati, what's the name of the other one? It's completely skipped by me at the minute. And they're mentioned in books by books say like Kasowski, Men, Beasts and Gods, where you get weird descriptions of an inner civilization powered by something that very clearly seems to be atomic power, but in a time frame when that simply wasn't possible. It wouldn't have been possible to describe that. You get hints of it in Madame Alexandra David Neal, a serious scholar. You get hints of it from the fact that there was a cult in that part of the world, Central Asia at that time, that actually was trying to bring Chinggis Khan back so they could sweep away the Westerners again. Strange stories that do interweave with actual history, John.
Well, you're I think trying to refer to the work of Ossendowski. I have it around here somewhere, his book on Kabbalah that Rene Guénon references.
Yeah, sorry, John. It was right at the back of my mind. I mean, certainly, as you said, Blavatsky talks about it. I think even Gurdjieff hints, although for him it seems to be a state of consciousness, a state of mind. So that was at Shambhala and Agati. I mean, in certain types of mythology, if that's the word I'm looking for, one is a city of sages and mystics, and the other's this sort of throbbing crucible of power brokers, ruled by the king of fear. It seems to go from one or the other. Sometimes all the sages live in one place, then they live in another place, and they're not at war. That's the weird thing. These remnants of a previous civilization, as some have said, some of the sages have given up interfering with the world altogether. They think we're a write-off, and you can't help wondering if they're not right with the way things are at the minute. Yes, John.
Well, there's also John Lloyd Urey, who wrote a book, Itadorfa, which is Aphrodite spelled backwards. And it has to do with the idea of the hollow earth. And it was actually illustrated by the same illustrator that illustrated The Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall. And these things all weave together. I mean, there's the secret practices of Sufi Freemasons, the Islamic teachings at the heart of alchemy, by Baron Rudolf von Sabotendorf, who was an interesting character when he started to see the way things were headed in good old Hitler's Germany. Well, let's just say he took off. He went to Turkey, and that was where his Sufi connections were. And so there's this whole esoteric underpinning in the Sufi interpretation of the rites of Freemasonry. But you made a point. There's 4 degrees in Freemasonry. Well, this is the 4th world, see, and so all genuine occultism will tell you, because you have a physical body, you have an etheric body, you have an astral body, and then it's crowned with the ego, which is the youngest member of our entelechy, shall we say. And so, and what we think of as our ego is the least part of that entelechy, which is really the kurios. It's our relationship to the Godhead, and works in us subconsciously. It is more strongly working from the heart below, realms that we're not cognizant of. I mean, when was the last time you were busying yourself with making your liver function? I mean, there's a lot of things that go on our behalf, of which obviously we're not responsible for. And so there's this great measure of being that has only been taken to its fullest extent through the incarnation of Christ. He was the only being that was able to take the pure divine nature and manifest as a human being. And that's the central mystery of the Rosicrucian or esoteric Christian stream, which is the true occultism according to the teachings of the West.
I don't think it's only a coincidence that main Freemasonry would say there are only 4 degrees. I think you've isolated something there very important, and that, of course, is why they're against whatever that means. Why they don't validate the side orders, which they tend to see as exaggerations or ephemera to those 4 stages. A very interesting attitude amongst Freemasons. I mean, as an aside, I mean, Grand Lodge in London has an incredible library, this gorgeous Art Deco building, and an incredible library. I used to be a member of the library. They were all expecting me to write a book on Solomon's Temple, which I never got the time to. Maybe one day, but certainly not yet. And they were very clear in their own minds what they thought was wrong with the side orders, with the cultic, with the occult experimentations of these other people. leading me back to the other city, which is either Shambhala or not, depending on who you read. It was almost like a seething cauldron, a seething furnace, as I say, ruled by the king of fear. And they were all trying to master subtle energies. So obviously, Vril turns up. But if you start reading other people, so what are these subtle energies? Are they the same thing, or are they related things? I mean, the Odic force. Oh God, these names I haven't thought about them in years. What was it? Not Feuerbach. Keely's dynaspheric force. Of course, you get in modern terms, you get the chi and the ki from martial arts, from meditation in the Far East. I mean, are all these the same thing or different variations of similar energies? The idea that somehow our body partly generates the human organism, the human genome itself, partly generates these energies, but is also partly built by them. A very, very strange and interesting idea, and it's behoven on us. It falls to us to do something about that, because they won't naturally evolve. It's up to us to make them evolve in us as an organism. I think that's interesting, and you see lots of parallels with lots of other people and their own particular version of this superpower, of this huge force that can be unleashed. I mean, what would it be in Hinduism? It would be prana. And, what would it be? God, I mean, even in Polynesia, there's mana. I mean, it goes across the world in various ways. Curiously, I did notice, though I haven't dug into it deeply enough, and it might be a coincidence, that most of this stuff is linked to the literature of the Hollow Earth. Although, of course, please remember, dear listeners, that might be a metaphor for the subconscious, as I was saying a minute ago, although it might not only be that. The exemplar for me that stands above the rest is always Madame Alexandra David Neal. Oh, yeah, I hate the pretensions of the woke generation. That everything started with them. A very great female scholar, recognised by the French Academy. The first woman. Is she the first European? I can't remember, to enter Tibet. What a titan, a titaness, but she can't possibly exist, John.
Yeah, a dear old friend of mine, Les Collins, who traveled into Tibet on his own way back when. He knew Alexandra David Neal, and quite a fascinating woman, to say the least. And of course, you have so much lore coming from her, and also from Nicholas Roerich and his wife Helena Roerich, pertaining to the concepts of Shambhala and Agartha also. And so there's a great deal of lore, but I'd like to drill down a little bit on what Rudolf Steiner says regarding Bulwer-Lytton, which is an interesting take on it. He says, and this is from Cosmosophy, the first lecture from September 23rd, 1921. That's Collected Works, volume 207. The links for it are below. And he says, and I quote, "In more recent centuries, actually since the middle of the 15th century, which should be the beginning of the consciousness soul age we're in," that's an aside by me, "since the middle of the 15th century, the human constitution has become such as to make it impossible to see these things in their original form. They could be absorbed only intellectually. One could receive concepts about them, but one could not attain a true experience of them. Individuals had only some intimations of it. Many people could penetrate into this realm of experience through such intimations. Such people have sometimes adopted strange forms of outer life, as for instance, Bulwer-Lytton, who wrote Zanoni. What he became in his later life can be grasped only if one knows how he received, to begin with, the tradition of self-knowledge, but how by virtue of his particular individual constitution, he was also able to penetrate into certain mysteries. He thereby became estranged from the natural ways of life. Precisely in him, it is possible to see what a man's attitude toward life becomes when he admits into his inner experience this foreign spiritual world, not merely into his concepts, but into his whole mood of soul. Many facts must then be judged by other than conventional standards. It appeared, of course, quite outlandish when Bulwer Lytton traveled about, speaking of his inner experiences with a certain emphasis, while a young woman who accompanied him played a harp-like instrument, for he always needed to have this harp music in between the passages of his talk. Here and there he appeared in gatherings where everyone else went on in a completely formal, conventional way. He would enter in his rather eccentric garb and sit down with his harp maiden seated in front of his knees. He would speak a few sentences, and then the harp maiden would play. Then he would continue his talk, and the maiden would play again. Something coquettish in the higher sense of the word. One cannot help characterizing it in this way at first, was thus introduced into the ordinary world where pedantic human convention had made such increasing inroads, particularly since the middle of the 15th century. So there you have him. He's showing that without stressing it, Steiner is so amazing the way he frames things. Because if you think about what he just said, he said that Bulwer Lytton essentially in a coquettish kind of way made it possible for people to begin considering these ideas that pertain to an entrance into the spiritual world and the domains of the divine spiritual beings. I mean, that is just astounding.
I hadn't heard any of that. I think it's astonishing. I do know, excuse me, that Bulwer Lytton led an eccentric life as he got older. There were rumours of hypnosis. I mean, hypnosis nowadays isn't hypnosis. Nowadays they use suggestion, the idea of mesmeric force after Anton Mesmer. The idea of a hypnotic influence or power seems to have been abandoned because it can't be pinned down by the nuts and bolts scientism of contemporary times. You know, there's an awful huge amount that can't be pinned down by the scientism of contemporary times. And in terms of, right, let me give you a story about an anecdote I know from the person it happened to. A friend of mine is a Brazilian sociologist who's studying and now teaching in this part of the world over here, who went with his girlfriend a couple of years back. He was visiting Brazil, where such things, of course, are still part of everyday life. Went to a stage show, and there was a well-known hypnotist on the stage. Also worked for a local hospital because they were experimenting with non-chemical pain relief techniques, something we need to get into here a lot more, because all those chemicals going through the system causes probably more harm than good a lot of the time. So we need to remember that. All my friend remembers is going to the show and coming out and people laughing at him, and him saying to his girlfriend, "Why are they laughing at me?" And her saying, "You don't remember a thing then?" And him saying, "Remember what?" And it was curiously someone who'd videoed the entire thing. A group of people, the hypnotist was using classical mesmeric techniques. It started by the guy at the front standing up, introducing himself, you know, all guns blazing from a modern show, the lighting, the music, the dancing girls, if you're still allowed to say that, you know, white suit, thumbs up. I'd love everyone in this audience to do blah, blah, blah. And most of the people in the audience did it. And I'm telling you all now that you can't stand up. Some stood up and some didn't. The ones that didn't, he called to the stage. And once they got to the stage, he basically did whatever he wanted. My friend's filmed playing air guitar. He's playing, leaping over the stage, doing a number of characters, speaking in languages. His description of what happened is very, very interesting. I'm not going to go into the mesmeric technique because I've got the same caution that Bulwer Lytton did. You have to be careful with these things. People play with them. Don't play. Does a child play with burning coals? It shouldn't. My friend said something very, very odd. He was at the restaurant, curiously, where this guy was also having supper afterwards. And he said, "How did you do it?" The guy wouldn't answer, but I recognized enough of what was said to realize what had been done. And my friend's self-description, you sort of go to the very, very back of your own mind. And you know that you're there, but you're not at the front of your mind. Something else is at the front of your mind, and something else is being directed by, dare I say, the magician. And all this went on for over 30 minutes. That is not a trivial length of time. And I'm not advocating hypnosis. I'm certainly not advocating anything playful with these techniques or forces, if that's what they are. I am saying they're very real. And I am saying if they're real, they are akin to the type of energy we are talking about. Therefore, what Steiner says actually is hugely important in more ways than one. And it vindicates yet again why we've got to take anthroposophy so seriously, because I can't really think of anybody else that's addressing these issues in a world getting more and more dangerous, with these things being withdrawn but still being there. What are your thoughts, John?
Well, it brings to mind a dear, dear friend of mine, Robert Eckerman, the man who helped me with the publishing of my books. And he told me a story that when he was a young man, at this time he was in his 80s, but he told the story of when he was in his 20s, he went to a movie theater. And back in the day, they used to have these events like this. Before the film, they'd have a guy come out and do magic tricks, or, it was more like vaudeville. You get a guy out and does some hypnosis. And the hypnotist did his hypnosis thing and then told everybody to raise their arms up and keep them up. And Robert complained because he said that he still has dreams where he's sitting in a chair and he can't pull his arms down. So it's something, it's a level of being that it's unhealthy to let someone else tamper with. And so I strongly recommend that people not get involved in hypnosis. It's the most potent level of being is that which works in you unconsciously, and you don't want to let somebody else tap the mother lode in your unconscious, because that's just not a good thing. But in getting into understanding these things, Rudolf Steiner in The Wonders of the World that I mentioned so often, he says, and here's a short quote, he says, "We cannot come to know occult facts by pinning ourselves down to a few abstract concepts. We have to approach the truth by throwing light on the facts from all sides. The paths of higher truth are complex, and only he can walk them who is willing patiently to trace their labyrinth." So it's a very involved process, which requires a great deal of patience, to say the least.
Oh, no, I mean, I 100% agree with you. I wouldn't be the last person to advocate exploring those techniques or using them. I mean, the one caveat, I suppose, with the hypnotist was the pain relief thing with the local hospital. But I don't know, it just strikes me as dangerous. And do they know really what they're dealing with? So, if we take Freud at his word, which is not really something we should do too often, this is the newest of all sciences. Psychology is the newest. Personally, I think it's the oldest. But, if it is the newest, then we really are infants learning about, ancient, ageless territories, and a couple of years. I mean, how long ago did Freud live? A couple of years simply isn't good enough to start making these gigantic statements about what works and what doesn't work and what the nature of these territories actually is. Particularly because it does seem to be the case that the minute they're being explored, all sorts of paraphysical, parapsychological abilities and energies are being released. And it makes me mindful of something I read years ago amongst the Tibetans. If a master, if a lama was having trouble with one of his students, maybe he'd do something magical to basically short circuit the stubbornness of the student and then completely withdraw. Completely withdraw from that, saying what you're doing is flattering the ego. All I did was show you that your position wasn't big enough. That sort of thing makes complete sense to me. And they do that in Taoism, I believe, in China. They will make a demonstration of something paranormal. I mean, I don't think the supernatural comes into it. We're not dealing with prophets. We're not dealing with saints. They will do something paranormal, paraphysical, and then say, look, the reason this was done was because your assumptions were getting in the way of the path you're walking. And that strikes me as a very mature and very interesting. But the fact they withdraw immediately cannot be simply brushed away. I can imagine these. I mean, I like Victorians having seances as a parlor game. I mean, we've got to forget, mustn't forget rather, that spiritualism was reaching its heyday in Victorian London, and spiritualism became a parlor game for ladies after supper. It completely. It's only now we realise how unwholesome and how vulgar that actually was. At that time, it wouldn't have crossed them because the scientism of their period was telling them it was inconsequential. I mean, certainly it's only Freud and then Jung that comes along and says, look, any manifestation, any dealing with the subconscious mind is anything apart from superficial and trivial. And that must be borne in mind. Particularly because I do believe all these energies exist, and that book is more than an allegory. As I say, I do think there's enough evidence. What was the masterpiece written on all this, John? What was it? Nicholas Goodrich Clark, The Occult Roots of Nazism. I think I've still got a copy around here somewhere. A real work of scholarship. You expect nothing less from Goodrich Clark. I mean, even he's toying with the idea, and he thinks most of it's nonsense. It's just, the embers of a certain type of aura that the Nazis have managed to accrue around themselves. But even he's toying with the idea that some of these notions did get to the inner circle of Himmler. I mean, the Hitler he presents is fearfully rational. The guy that simply wants to forget German prehistory because the Greeks were more evolved. How dare they? Than the Germans? How dare they? And the Romans, they had all this knowledge, and that they had more knowledge in the Far East at that particular period. So his view, according to Goodrich Clark, excuse me again, would be simply better to just forget all that and look at what Germany's doing now. So you have the cold rationalist known in the writings of C.S. Lewis, that hideous strength, that wonderful short story of a brain without feelings, without empathy, without compassion, without any basic humanity, which would come out in the architecture, the autobahns. If there's a problem stood in your way, treat it like a military man and then remove it. That does sound a lot like Hitler. Whereas it's the twisted, bitter, mystical Himmler, as I say, the second genius of the Third Reich, who wants to say, well, hang on, there are other more potent energies at work here, and let's see what we can do to harness them for the empire, but harness them for the Reich. And the fact that someone of Goodrich Clark's status and caliber is actually playing with those ideas not only frightens me to the core, but I think must shed an additional light, a new light on what we think we're dealing with here and the works of Bulwer Lytton. As I say, he lived like a shaman At the end of his life, if half the stories are true, he was trying to work with, I'm trying to avoid the ancient language, with astral terrains, with etheric beings. He was trying to work with these parapsychologies, and certainly felt he was getting somewhere. He felt that he was collaborating with other forces and other spheres very increasingly easily, to such an extent that when that reached the Soviet Union, which it did after the war, some people think it might have reached there before then, but I'm willing to go with the scholarship and say it was after the war. I mean, you get books like Red Shambhala, where the KGB were very, very clearly interested in what the Nazis had been doing and in what their speculations had been, and themselves started pouring fortunes into exploring Central Asia, exploring subtle energies, and trying to look for these terrains in case there was something there, and they themselves could make a deal with it. John.
Yes, well, we have to admire the Russian people. They still read books, by the way. They're avid readers in Russia, and so you get a remarkable response if you have the good fortune of developing friendships with people, irrespective of whatever politics might mean or not mean. Who cares? Like, for example, Dr. Yuri over in St. Petersburg, who comes up with some of the best questions for Douglas and I for the shows that we do together. And when you start looking into that, the psychic discoveries behind the Iron Curtain was a groundbreaking work in parapsychology back in that was in the early 70s. And that was something that really showed the seriousness with which the subject was being approached within Russia. And likewise, there were experiments done in the U.S. and in Britain, and these things are there, and as is the tendency in all these types of things, you'll get people that want to approach the subject. And I see guys over at Alex Jones Network trying to approach some of this topic, but they don't know anything about occultism, and so they tend to just lump it all together and say, well, this is this bad stuff over here. And they don't understand that the unfolding of their Christian soul is going to proceed according to the principles of Christian occultism. Whether one chooses to agree with it or not, it matters not to me. But so you have to be kind of delicate with some of these subjects as people defend their exegesis of Scripture, and it seems like they worship the Scripture more than they worship Christ, and so you have this whole idea that Ahriman will be the greatest quoter of Scripture, and so that's not enough. It has to do with the actual content of your heart, and when one goes through the experience of the dweller on the threshold, and one is able to face these flaws, and they're the flaws that are going to bring you back into the cycle of reincarnation. These are the challenges that you're going to have to face at some point. If one can steadfastly find your way past the dweller on the threshold who's protecting you from the contents of the spiritual world that you're incapable of bearing at your current stage of development, you can cross the threshold and see that in reality, all these apparitions that people like David Icke see with the dragons and all that, that's what you look like. I hate to embarrass you, but that's what you look like in the astral world at this stage of evolution, with a receding forehead and extended egoistic jaw. So if you're seeing a dragon, look in the mirror, because that's what you're doing. You're looking in the mirror. And so more than a few people have been frightened off with that type of an apparition because they, however, unlawfully slipped across the threshold and got an experience of their astral nature that has that reptilian visage to it. But of course there are those that celebrate it. I like Prince Charles. He wanted the dragon of Wales as the banner for his coronation. It's like, well, that's interesting. What's up with that? Well, he's been in charge of Cornwall for quite some time, and that whole Western English thing. But I think it has more to do with him taking pride in being a descendant of Vlad the Impaler in Romania. He likes to hang out in that old castle there. Old friend of mine, she's a direct descendant of Vlad's brother. It's like, so what? Who cares who your ancestors are? That's the way I look at it. That's so done. We've passed all that since 1879 in November, as I've said ad nauseum, and now it's time to move the individual taking up the initiative to try and conquer themselves first before they conquer the world. And so that's the challenge, because if one does it unlawfully, one can become obsessed with power. And then you get that whole thing where even Napoleon lost his way and decided he wanted to be declared emperor. Just think if Beethoven would have, what would have happened to him? He was so outraged because he wrote the Ninth Symphony for Napoleon, and then with the ending in the Ode to Joy, and then when he saw what Napoleon did, having himself declared emperor, he just like totally abandoned Napoleon. But that being said, by the way, Renzi by Richard Wagner is based on one of Beauverlitt's novels. So this is a subject we can return to some other time, because there's so much there. There's really fertile territory which to mine. But I always like to show my gratefulness regarding our show here, and that this podcast has been made possible by the generous support of Tyler and Douglas, Vadim, Vivian, Tim, Neil, Christian, Mark, Maud, Drewman, Laura, Paula, Rick, Michael, Beth, Anil, Fred, Ishtar, Anna, Russell, Mike, Ray, Whitney, James, Marilyn, and so many others over the years. I want to thank you all for supporting our humble efforts. And of course, if you'd like to buy us a cup of coffee, and at this stage, I think David will agree with me, no amount is too small. It would be very helpful in our somewhat straitened circumstances. So that for Reverend David, the Pastor David, that is, that's paypal.me/D Parry 777, and for myself, paypal.me/John Barnwell 888. And Reverend David has 3 books, and the first one, of course, is The Grammar of Witchcraft, and that's a Shakespearean study, not a grimoire. And he has Shakespearean-esque poetry in Caliban's Redemption, a magisterial work, and his magnum opus is Mount Athos Inside Me, Essays on Religion, Swedenborg and the Arts, and that's edited by the very talented young man Daniela Hadi Irandust, who is also the author of On the Philosophy of Education Towards an Anthroposophical View, and that's available on Amazon, as are all of Reverend David's books. You could even download a free PDF of it or a free ebook on Amazon. And I have 2 books, and let me grab them here. This one is currently, I'm working towards reprinting it. It's The Arcana of the Grail Angel. It's 640 pages, The Spiritual Science of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail, a study developed out of the work of Rudolf Steiner of the underground stream of esoteric Christianity, which flowed from the Brotherhood of the Holy Grail to the Order of the Knights Templar and the True Rosicrucian Order, as afforded by my best buddy Douglas Gabriel, There's 640 pages, and it's loaded with cosmological diagrams that will help you in your studies of the work of Rudolf Steiner. And all of those diagrams are available and reproduced in my second volume, The Arcana of Light on the Path. Plus, I added a great many more. This has a foreword by the late William Bento, my old buddy Willie, and he wrote the foreword. But there's all these Grail diagrams that are based upon the watercolors that were created by Aaron Pfeiffer, the founder of biodynamic gardening. And I added a great many more. And this will help one greatly in their studies. These are available for me directly on eBay. If you're outside the continental US, you can contact me through private message on Facebook or through the academia link below. And so I think I covered most of the bases, but David usually ends us with a prayer.
I just need to say quickly, I wasn't equating Nazi Germany with Russia in any way, shape, or form. I was equating the SS with the KGB, but that is an entirely different case. No, I mean, Russian culture, even Soviet culture, was actually something very humane and very aspirational and very evolutionary. So that I didn't want anyone thinking that I was trying to say they were the same thing, because they really are chalk and cheese. There's nothing similar there. As I say, I'm a bit frazzled today because the first Sunday of the month we hold our services of worship. The second Sunday of the month, I have 2 hours preaching to the online Persian Christian Fellowship before this show. So I'm trying desperately to sort of retain focus. But I didn't get the chance on that show, and I rarely get the chance on this show to say the Paternoster. I said it last week, but hey, you can't say it enough. My friends, would you bow your hearts and say with me very briefly, very thoughtfully, very consciously, the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you so much, and thank everybody for coming to spend a little time with us, and we will see you next week.